Hey everyone, so we're continuing on to the second chapter in your book, and the topic here relates back to the three main goals of conservation biology, which we talked about in chapter 1. So the first one of those was to document the full range of biological diversity or biodiversity on Earth. So that's what we're going to talk about today. What is biodiversity? It is a term that was coined by E.O. Wilson, who's a really famous biologist. He is known for studying ants and for looking at how ant societies work. But he's also known for his work on biological conservation and biodiversity. And so biodiversity basically is what it sounds like. It's biological diversity. They've combined those two words together to make the word biodiversity. And biodiversity includes lots of different levels of biological organization, but not all of them. So primarily it includes the levels of organism to ecosystem, but we will also talk about genetic biodiversity. But note, we're not talking about these other smaller things. So we're not talking about biodiversity of organs or tissues or cells or anything like that. So mostly diversity in populations, communities, and ecosystems, and we'll talk about the genetics within populations as well. So, in the biological hierarchy, we're going to be talking about populations, communities, and ecosystems. So, take a second and think about what you think those terms mean. I know you've all heard them before. And what are the differences between among these three different terms? Okay, so what did you come up with? A population is a group of organisms that occur in the same area and have the potential to interbreed. So they're all of the same species. So it's a group of, an example might be a group of deer that live in northern Louisiana, a group of white oak trees. There are a bunch of different individuals of that species in a similar area. Community. So what makes a population different from a community? A community means all of the different species that live and interact with one another in a particular area. So a population all have to be the same species. In a community, we're still talking about one area, but we're looking at all the different kinds of species that live there. So all the plants, all the animals, all the fungi, all the bacteria, all the different kinds of things that interact with one another in a particular area. Now, what about an ecosystem? What makes that different than a community? That's when we add all the abiotic components as well. So that's when we include nutrients, which aren't living, but they're an important part of making an ecosystem work. So it includes the mineral components of the soil, the rocks, the air, any kind of chemicals that are inorganic or organic that are in the soil or air that are used by the different species. So an ecosystem is the broadest term, but each of these things are talking about a particular area. So we could talk about the ecosystem that's in the Arboretum on South Campus at Louisiana Tech. We could talk about the community there. We could talk about the population of a particular type of tree or a particular species of birds. So genes and species are also important, but we'll get to those later. So biodiversity, I said it included mostly things from individual to ecosystem. So we want to include in biodiversity genes, individuals, populations, species, communities, and ecosystems. And each of these levels includes diversity both within each one of these and among the different components. I do want to highlight that the other things that aren't included really in biodiversity, again, are things like cells. We don't care about a diversity of cells. a diversity of tissues or organs or molecules. None of that's really included in biodiversity. It's really individuals, populations, species, communities, ecosystems, and then also genes. So there are three main levels of biodiversity. One is species diversity, and that includes all the species on Earth, from single-celled bacteria, protists, to the things we tend to think of more like plants and animals. We have genetic diversity, which is also very important. It includes the genetic variation within species, both among different populations and also among individuals within the same population. And then the third level of biodiversity is ecosystem diversity, the different biological communities and their associations with chemical and physical environment. So that's the ecosystem. So I'm going to talk about each of these three levels of biodiversity. These each are very important, and they're all a focus of conservation biology. And this figure kind of illustrates these three different types of biodiversity. So we have genetic diversity is illustrated here with the different ladybugs. They're showing the different spots to be heritable, differences determined by the genetics of each individual. And so we can see that there is a diversity of genes among the individuals in these ladybugs. Species diversity is just the number of different kinds of species. And then ecosystem diversity, we can see here that there's forest, there's a pond, there's more of a kind of riparian zone where there are different wetland plants that live near the edge of the pond. We have ecosystem diversity looking at these different types of ecosystems that are interacting together. So the first one is species diversity, and that's all the species including their ecological and morphological traits and their evolutionary histories. Functional diversity looks at the ecological roles or traits of species. Phylogenetic diversity looks at the diversity of evolutionary histories. And one of the challenges here is to name and classify species in an objective and testable manner. So the next thing we're going to talk about is what is a species, and I will leave that for the next video.